The Pool of Fire by John Christopher. Chapter 3. The Green Man on the Green Horse. It took us 2 full days on horseback, riding hard for the most part. Winter was closing in again fast, the days shortening, a long fine spell of St. Luke's summer breaking up into cold, unsettled weather coming from the west. For the whole of one morning we rode with sleet and sharp rain driving into our faces. We slept the first night in a small inn, but as the second day drew to its close, we were in wild, deserted country, with sheep cropping thin grass and not even a sign of a shepherd or a shepherd's hut. We were, we knew, near the end of our journey. At the top of a slope, we reined in our horses and looked down to the sea, a long line beating against the unpromising rocky coast, all empty as the land was, except away to the north, on the very edge of visibility, something like a squat finger pointing upward. I spoke to Fritz, and he nodded, and we rode for it. As we got nearer, we could see that it was the ruin of a castle, set on a promontory of rock. Nearer still, we could make out that there had been a small harbor on the far side, and that there were more ruins there, though on a more modest scale. Fishermen's collages, most likely. It would have been a fishing village once, but was now abandoned. We saw no indication of life either there or in the castle, which loomed harsh and black against the deepening gray sky. A broken potholed road led up to a gateway from which on one side hung the shattered remnants of a wooden gate barred with iron. Riding through, we found ourselves in a courtyard. It was as empty and lifeless as everything else, but we dismounted and tied our horses to an iron ring that had, perhaps, been used for that very purpose 1,000 years before. Even if we had got our map reference wrong, we were going to have to leave the search until morning. But I could not believe we had erred. From behind an embrasure, I saw a dim flicker of light and touched Fritz's arm, pointing. It disappeared and was visible again farther along the wall. I could just make out that there was a door and that the light was moving in that direction. We went toward it and reached it as a figure, carrying a lamp, turned a corner in the corridor within. He held the lamp higher, shining it in our faces. "You're a bit late," he said. "We'd given you up for today." I went forward with a laugh. I still could not see his face, but I knew well enough whose voice it was. Beanpole's. Certain rooms, those facing seaward for the most part, and a section of the dungeons had been refurbished and made habitable. We were given a good hot supper of rich stew, followed by home-baked bread and French cheese, wheel-shaped, dusted white outside, creamy yellow within, strong-tasting and satisfying. There was hot water to wash ourselves, and beds had been made up in one of the spare rooms with sheets. We slept well, lulled by the roar and rumble of the sea breaking on the rocks, and awoke refreshed. For breakfast, there were others present, as well as Beanpole. I recognized 2 or 3 faces that I had known as belonging to that group which studied the wisdom of the ancients. Someone else, who was familiar, came in while we were eating. Julius hobbled across the room toward us, smiling. "Welcome, Fritz and Will. It's good to see you back with us again." We had asked questions of Beanpole and received evasive answers. All would be explained in the morning, he told us. And after breakfast we went, with Julius and Beanpole and half a dozen others, to a huge room on the castle's first floor. There was a great gaping window looking out to sea, across which a frame of wood and glass had been fastened, and an altogether enormous fireplace in which wood crackled and burned. We sat down on benches behind a long rough-hewn table, in no particular order. Julius spoke to us. "I shall satisfy the curiosity of Will and Fritz first," he said. "The rest of you must bear with me." He looked at us. This is one of several places at which research into ways of defeating the masters is being carried out. Many ideas have been put forward, many of them ingenious. All have drawbacks, though, and the chief drawback common to every one is that we still, despite the reports you two made, know so little about our enemy. He paused for a moment. A second trio was sent north to the games last summer. Only one qualified to be taken into the city. We have heard nothing more of him. He may yet escape. We hope he will. But we cannot depend on that. In any case, it is doubtful that he could give us the information we want. because what we really need, it has been decided, is one of the masters in our hands, alive for preference, so that we can study him. My face may have shown my skepticism. I have always heard it shows too much. At any rate, Julius said, "Yes, Will, an impossible requirement, one would think, but perhaps not quite impossible. This is why you two have been called in to help us. You have actually seen the inside of a tripod when you were taken to the city. You have, it is true, described it to us already, and fully. But if we are going to capture a master, we must get him out of that metal stronghold in which he strides about our lands, and for that the smallest recollection which you may be able to dredge from your memories could be of help." Fritz said, "You talk of taking one alive, sir, but how can that be done? Once he is out of the tripod, he will choke within seconds in our atmosphere." "A good point," Julius said, "but we have an answer to it. You brought back samples from the city. We have learned how to reproduce the green air in which they live. A room has already been prepared here in the castle, sealed and with an airlock to enable us to pass in and out." Fritz said, "But if you manage to bring a tripod here and wreck it here, the others will come looking for it. They can destroy the castle easily enough." "We also have a box big enough to hold one of them, and can seal that. If we make the capture farther along the coast, we can bring him here by boat." I said, "And the means of capturing, sir?" I would not have thought that was easy. "No," Julius agreed, "not easy. But we have been studying them. They are creatures of routine and generally follow particular paths. We have mapped and timetabled many of them. There is a place some 50 miles to the north where one passes every 9 days. It strides across rough common land at the sea's edge. Between one passing and the next, we have 9 days to dig a hole and cover it lightly with brush and clods. We will bring our tripod down, and after that, all we have to do is winkle the master out and get him into his box and onto the boat lying hard by. From what you and Fritz told us, that their breathing is much slower than ours, there should be no danger of his suffocating before we can get a mask on him." Fritz objected. "They can communicate with each other and with the city by invisible rays." Julius smiled. "We can handle that part too. Now talk to us about the tripods. There is paper in front of you and pencils. Draw diagrams of them. Drawing will refresh your memories also." We were a week at the castle before moving north. During that time, I learned a little from Beanpole and the others of the great strides that had been taken during the previous year in relearning the skills of the ancients. A breakthrough had been made by an expedition into the ruins of one of the great cities, where a library had been found containing thousands on thousands of books, which explained the marvels of the time before the tripods came. These gave access to an entire world of knowledge. It was possible now, Beanpole told me, to make those bulbs which by means of the power called electricity would glow with light far brighter and more constant than the oil lamps and candles to which we were accustomed. It was possible to get heat from an arrangement of wires, to build a carriage which would travel along not pulled by horses, but by means of a small engine inside it. I looked at Beanpole when he said that. Then the chemin de fer could be made to work again, as it used to work, very easily. We know how to machine metals, to make the artificial stone which the ancients called concrete. We could put up towering buildings, create great cities again. We could send messages by the invisible rays that the masters use, even send pictures through the air. There is so much that we can do, or could learn to do in a short time, but we are concentrating only on those things which are of direct and immediate help in defeating the enemy. For instance, at one of our laboratories, we have developed a machine which uses great heat to cut through metal. It will be waiting for us in the north. Laboratories, I wonder, what were they? My mind was confused by much of what he said. We had both learned a lot during the time we had been separated, but his knowledge was so much greater and more wonderful than mine. He looked a lot older. The ridiculous contraption of lenses, which he had worn when we first set eyes on him at the other side of the smoky bar in the French fishing town, had been replaced by a neat, symmetrical affair which sat on the bridge of his long, thin nose and gave him an air of maturity and authority. They were called spectacles, he had told me, and others among the scientists wore them. Spectacles, scientists, so many words describing things outside my ken. I think he realized how much at a loss I felt. He asked me questions about my own experiences, and I told him what I could. He listened to it all intently, as though my ordinary travels were as interesting and important as the fantastic things he had been learning and doing. My heart warmed to him for that. We set up camp in caves not far from the intended place of ambush. The boat we were to use, a 40-foot fishing smack, stayed close at hand, her nets out to provide an appearance of innocence. In fact, she caught a fair haul of fish, mostly mackerel. Some provided rations for us, and the rest were thrown back. On a particular morning, we kept well out of sight while two of our number went farther up to hide behind rocks and watch the tripod pass. Those of us who stayed in the cave heard it, anyway. It was making one of the calls whose meaning we did not know, an eerie warbling sound. As it faded in the distance, Julius said, "On time to the minute. Now we start to work." We labored hard at preparing the trap. 9 days was not so long a time when it involved digging away enough earth to serve as a pitfall for a thing with 50-foot legs, leaving a pattern of supports on which the camouflage must rest. Beanpole, pausing in his digging, spoke wistfully of something which had been called a bulldozer, and which could move earth and stones by the ton. But that was another thing there had not been time enough to recreate. At any rate, we got through the task with a day to spare. The day seemed longer than the previous 8 had. We sat in the mouth of the cave looking out to a gray, calm, cold sea patched with mist. At least the sea journey should not offer much difficulty. Once we had trapped our tripod and caught our master, that was. The weather stayed cold and dry next morning. We took up our places, all of us this time, an hour before the tripod was due to pass. Fritz and I were together, Beanpole with the man working the jammer. This was a machine that could send out invisible rays of its own to break up the rays coming to and going from the tripod and isolate it, for the time being, from any contact with the others. I was full of doubts about this, but Beanpole was very confident. He said these rays could be interrupted by natural things like thunderstorms. The masters would think something like that had happened, until it was too late to do anything about it. The minutes and seconds crawled by. Gradually, my concentration turned into a sort of daze. I was jolted back to reality by Fritz silently touching my shoulder. I looked and saw the tripod swing around the side of a hill to the south, heading directly for us. Immediately, I tensed in body and mind for the part I was to play. It was traveling at an average speed. In less than 5 minutes, then, without warning, the tripod stopped. It halted with one of its 3 feet raised, looking absurdly like a dog begging for a bone. For 3 or 4 seconds it stayed there. The foot came down. The tripod continued its progress, but it was no longer heading our way. It had changed course, and would miss us by a couple of miles at least. In stunned amazement, I watched it travel on and disappear. From behind a clump of trees on the other side of the pitfall, Andre, our leader, came out and waved. We went to join him along with the others. It was soon established what had gone wrong. The tripod's hesitation had coincided with the ray jammer being turned on. It had stopped and then shied away. The man who had worked the machine said, "I should have waited till it was on top of the trap. I didn't expect it to react like that." Someone asked, "What do we do now?" The letdown feeling was apparent in all of us. All the work and waiting for nothing. It made our entire project of overthrowing the masters seem hopeless, childlike almost. Julius had come hobbling up. He said, "We wait, of course." His calmness was steadying. "We wait till the next time, and then we don't use the jammer until the absolutely last moment. Meanwhile, we can extend the trap farther still." So the working and waiting went on for 9 more days, and 0 hour came around again. The tripod appeared, as it had done previously, marched around the side of the hill, reached the point where it had stopped this time before. This time it did not stop, but it did not come on toward us either. Without hesitation, it took the identical course it had taken after its earlier check. Seeing it go well out of our reach was more than a double bitterness. Holding a council of war, we were in low spirits. Even Julius, I thought, was dismayed. though he did his best not to show it. I found it quite impossible to conceal my own despair. Julius said, "One sees how it works. They follow set courses on these patrols. If the course is varied for some reason, the variation is kept on subsequent trips." A scientist said, "It probably has something to do with automatic piloting." I wondered what that was. The course is plotted, and if you override it, you set up a new pattern which remains constant unless that is overridden in turn. I see the mechanism of it. Which is more than I did. Talking about the why and wherefore did not strike me as important. The question was, how to get the tripod now? Someone suggested digging another pitfall across the new course. The remark fell into silence, which Julius broke. "We could do that, but it does not pass within 2 miles of the shore, and the going in between is very bad. No road, not even a track. I think we should have them swarming around us before we had got our prisoner half the distance to the boat." The silence was resumed and lengthened. After some seconds, Andre said, "I suppose we could call this operation off temporarily. We could find another track within reach of the sea and work on that instead." Someone else said, "It took us 4 months to find this one. Finding another could take us as long or longer." And every day counted. None of us needed telling that. Silence fell again. I tried to think of something, but discovered only a hopeless blank in my mind. There was a sharp wind and a smell of snow in the air. Land and sea alike were black and desolate under a lowering sky. It was Beanpole who spoke at last. He said, diffident in the presence of our elders, "It does not seem that the jamming last week made it suspicious. It would hardly have come so close again if so, or it would have come closer yet to investigate. The altered course is, well, more or less an accident." Andre nodded. "That seems to be true. Does it help?" "If we could lure it back onto the old course." "An excellent idea. The only problem is how. What is there that will lure a tripod? Do you know? Does anyone?" Beanpole said, "I'm thinking of something Will told me that Fritz and he witnessed. He told them briefly the story I had told him about the hunt. They listened, but when he had finished, one of the scientists said, 'We know of this. It happens in other places as well. But it's a tradition and caused as much by the capped as by the tripods. Do you suggest we start a tradition during the next 9 days?'" Beanpole started to say something, which was interrupted. All our nerves were frayed, tempers likely to be short. Julius, though, cut across the interruption. "Go on, Jean-Paul." He sometimes stammered a little when he was nervous, and did so now, but the impediment disappeared as he warmed up to what he was saying. "I was thinking, we know they are curious about strange things. When Will and I were floating downriver on a raft, one of them veered off course and smashed the raft with its tentacle. If someone could attract this one's attention and perhaps lead it into the trap, I think it might work." "It might at that," Andre objected. "To attract attention and then stay out of its clutches long enough to bring it to us, it sounds like a tall order." "On foot," Beanpole said, "it would be impossible. But in the hunt that Will and Fritz saw, the men were on horseback. One lasted for quite a long time, covering a distance as great as the one we want, or more, before he was caught." There was a pause again as we considered what he had said. Julius said thoughtfully, "It might work, but can we be quite sure he will rise to the bait? As you say, they are curious about strange things. A man on horseback, they see them every day by the score. If the man were dressed in something bright, and perhaps the horse painted—" "Green," Fritz said. "It is their own color after all. A green man on a green horse. I think that would attract attention all right." There was a murmur of approval of the idea. Julius said, "I like that. Yes, it could do. All we need now is our horse and rider." I felt excitement rise in me. They were mostly scientists, unused to such humdrum physical pursuits as horse riding. The two with the obviously best claim were Fritz and Di, and Crest and I had grown used to and skilled in understanding one another through a long year's journeying. I said, catching Julius's eye, "Sir, if I might suggest—" We used a green dye on Crest, which would wash off afterward. He took the indignity well, with only a snort or two of disgust. The color was bright emerald and looked startling. I wore a jacket and trousers of the same eye-wrenching hue. I objected when Beanpole approached my face with a rag dipped in the dye, but on Julius's confirmation, submitted. Fritz, looking on, burst into laughter. He was not much given to mirthfulness, but then I suppose he was not often treated to so comic a spectacle. During the previous 9 days, I had rehearsed and re-rehearsed my part in this morning's events. I was to pick up the tripod as it came around the hill and, as soon as it made a move in my direction, gallop a full speed for the pitfall. We had fixed a narrow causeway over the top, which we hoped would take Crest's weight and mine, and marked it with signs which were meant to be conspicuous enough for me to see, and yet unlikely to attract suspicion on the part of the masters in the tripod. The latter had seemed the greater risk, so we had erred on the side of caution. It was a tenuous and ill-defined path I had to follow, and 3 or 4 times we had found ourselves off course and only saved by a last-minute swerve from plunging into the pit below. Now at last all was ready, with preparations made and only requiring to be translated into action. I checked Crest's girths for the 10th time. The others shook hands with me and withdrew. I was very lonely as I watched them go. Now there was the waiting again, familiar yet unfamiliar. This time it was more crucial, and this time I was alone. I felt it first, the earth beneath us vibrating to the distant stamp of the huge metal feet. Another and another. A steady succession of them, each more audible than the one before. I had Crest's head pointed in the direction of the pitfall, with my own head twisted around to the right, watching for the tripod. It came, a monstrous leg breaking the line of the hill, followed by the hemisphere. I shivered, and felt Crest shiver as well. I did my best to pat him back into calm. I was on the alert for any deviation from the course the tripod had now followed on 2 occasions. If it did not move toward me, I must move toward it. I hoped I would not have to. It would take me farther away from the pitfall, and mean also that I had to turn to lead it there, both procedures which would make the enterprise that much more perilous. Its course changed. It did not break step, but one of the legs swung around. I wasted no more time, but touched my heels to Crest's side. He shot off, and the chase was on. I wanted to look back to see how my pursuer was closing on me, but dared not. Every scrap of energy had to go into the gallop. I could tell, though, by the shortening of the intervals between footfalls, that the tripod was increasing speed. Landmarks familiar from my practice runs fell away on either side. Ahead there was the coast, the sea dark gray but capped with white from a freshening wind. The wind blew in my face, and I felt an absurd resentment against it for slowing, even by a fraction of a second, my flight. I passed a thorn bush I knew, a rock shaped like a cottage loaf, no more than 1/4 of a mile to go, and as I framed the thought, I heard the whistling of steel through the air, the sound of the tentacles swishing down toward me. I made a guess and urged Crest to the right. I thought I had got away with it this time, that the tentacle would miss, then felt Crest shudder violently with the shock of being hit by the metal flail. It must have caught him on the hindquarters, just behind the saddle. He swayed and collapsed. I managed to get my feet out of the stirrups and went forward over his head as he fell. I hit the ground rolling, scrambling to my feet, and ran. At every instant I expected to be plucked up into the air, but the master controlling the tripod was more immediately concerned with Crest. I saw him as I glanced quickly back, lifted, struggling feebly, and then brought within closer view of the green ports at the bottom of the hemisphere. I dared not pay any more attention to him, but ran on. A couple of 100 yards only. If the tripod concentrated on Crest long enough, I was there. I risked glancing back again just in time to see my poor horse dropped from a height of 60 feet, to land in a broken heap on the ground, and to see the tripod begin to move again in a new pursuit. I could run no faster than I was running already. The metal feet thudded after me. The edge of the pitfall seemed to get no nearer. For the last 50 yards, I thought I was finished, that the tentacle was on the point of reaching me. I think perhaps the master was playing with me, like a great steel cat with a scurrying mouse. That was what Beanpole suggested afterward. All I knew then was that my legs were aching, my lungs, it seemed, on the point of bursting. I became aware as I reached the pitfall of a new hazard. I had learned the trail across from horseback height, and things were different to a running man. The change in perspective was utterly confusing. At the last moment, I recognized a certain stone and made for it. I was on the causeway, but I still had to get across, and the tripod had to follow me. I knew that it had done so, that I had succeeded in my task, when, in place of the stamp of a foot on solid ground, I heard a ripping, tearing noise behind me, and at the same time felt the surface beneath my feet change and collapse. I grabbed wildly at a length of branch which had been knitted into the camouflaged surface of the pit. It came away, and I was falling again. I seized another branch, of thorn this time, and it held longer, lacerating my hands as I gripped it. While I was suspended like this, the sky darkened above me. The pit's surface had given way beneath the foremost leg of the tripod, with the second leg in midair. Off balance, I was plunging forward, the hemisphere swinging helplessly across and down. Looking up, I saw it pass me, and a moment later heard the shock of its impact with the solid ground on the far side of the pit. I myself was hanging halfway up the pit, at grave risk of falling the rest of the way. No one I knew was going to come to my assistance. They all had more important work to do. I set myself to collect my scattered senses and to climb, slowly and gingerly, up the network of reeds and branches on which I was suspended. By the time I reached the scene, things were well underway. There was no external seal on the compartment which was used to transport human beings, as we had been transported from the games field to the city, and the circular door had, in fact, fallen open with the shock. Fritz guided the team with the metal-cutting machine into that cabin, and they got to work on the inner door. They wore masks in protection against the green air which eddied out as they cut their way through. It seemed a long time to those waiting outside, but in reality it was only a matter of minutes before they were in and tackling the dazed masters. Fritz confirmed that one of them was definitely alive, and they pulled the mask that had been prepared over his head and tightened it around his middle. I watched as they heaved him out. A cart had been drawn up beside the fallen hemisphere, and on it there was the huge crate, made of wood but sealed with a sort of tar which would keep the green air in and our own out, which was to take him. He was pulled and pushed and at last dropped in, a grotesque figure with his 3 short stumpy legs, long tapering conical body, 3 eyes and 3 tentacles, and that repulsive green reptilian skin I remembered with such vivid horror. The top dropped down on the crate, and more men went to work at sealing it. A pipe leading from one corner was blocked temporarily. Once on the boat, it would be utilized to change his stale air for fresh. Then the word was given to the men on the horse teams, and the horses pulled away, dragging the cart and its cargo toward the beach. The rest of us cleared our traces as far as possible from the scene. The masters, when they came on the broken tripod, could no longer doubt that they were facing organized opposition. It was not a casual, haphazard thing such as our destruction of the tripod on the way to the White Mountains had been. But even though this amounted to a declaration of war, there was no point in leaving unnecessary clues behind. I should have liked to do something about burying Crest, but there was no time for that. In case the trick might serve a second time, we sponged the green dye off his body and left him there. I walked apart from the others as we came away, not wanting them to see the tears that were in my eyes. The cart was hauled out through the waves over a firm sandy bottom until the water lapped against the chests of the horses. The fishing boat, which had come inshore, was shallow enough in draft to get alongside, and there the crate with our prisoner was winched on board. Seeing the smoothness of the operation, I was more than ever amazed and impressed by the planning that had gone into it all. The horses were unharnessed from the cart and led ashore. From there they were scattered north and south in pairs, one ridden, one led. The rest of us heaved our wet, shivering bodies over the gunwales. One thing remained to be done. A line had been fastened to the cart, and, as the boat stood off, it rolled behind us till the waves closed over it. When that happened, the line was cut, and the boat, released from this burden, seemed to lift out of the gray waters. On shore, the horses had disappeared. All that was left was the shattered wreck of the tripod, with a faint green mist blowing away from the mutilated hemisphere. The remaining masters inside were certainly dead by now. What really mattered was that the jammer had worked. The tripod lay there crumpled and alone. There was no sign of any others coming to its help. Our course was south. With the wind stiff and blowing only from a few points north of west, progress was slow, involving a fair amount of tackling. Our all available hands bent to this, and gradually the distance from our embarkation point increased. There was a headland which we needed to clear. We rounded it with painful sluggishness, wallowing in the tide, which had just begun to turn. But now the shore was very distant, the tripod no more than a dot on the horizon. They brought up mulled ale for us from the galley to warm our chilled bones.